What would you do if a spacecraft we stopped worrying about suddenly whispered back from the dark? What if that whisper did not sound like a machine coming home, but like something else had learned how to use its voice? Before we go deeper, do something small that helps this kind of story travel tap, like subscribe if space mysteries pull you in, and send this video to one friend who never looks at the night sky the same way again. For most people, Voyager 2 is a name from an old science book, a brave machine, a golden record, a proud mission from another age. But for the people who built it, tracked it, and kept listening long after the world moved on, Voyager 2 was never just a museum piece. It was a heartbeat drifting farther away every year, carrying a small piece of us into a place no human being will ever see with their own eyes. That is why the silence mattered. Not the normal silence of deep space, not the kind that comes from distance. This was the kind of silence that feels final, slow, administrative. The silence of checklists, failing power, retired systems, and quiet acceptance. A machine older than the internet, older than most people watching this video, older than the careers of many engineers now sitting in control rooms. A machine that had outlived its mission, then outlived the expectations placed on it, then kept going anyway. And then, one day, after years of nothing, a trace appeared. Not a speech, not a dramatic alarm, just a signal so faint it could have been ignored by anyone who wanted an easy explanation. A brief pulse, thin, clean, timed, almost polite. The kind of thing that makes one person on a night shift lean closer to a monitor and wonder if they are tired. The kind of thing that makes a second person double-check the equipment. The kind of thing that makes a room go still because everyone knows the same thing at the same time. That should not be there. If you want to understand why the moment is so chilling, you have to understand what Voyager 2 really is. It launched in 1977, carrying the confidence of a civilization that believed the future would come fast. And in many ways it did. Voyager 2 crossed the outer solar system and showed humanity worlds that had never been seen up close. It flew by Jupiter and revealed violent storms and restless moons. It passed Saturn and watched a giant ringed planet hold court in cold sunlight. It moved on to Uranus and Neptune, places so distant they once felt more like ideas than destinations. It sent back images, measurements, surprises, and questions. It turned dots and telescopes into real places. That alone would have been enough to make it historic. But the mission did not end there. After the grand tour of the outer planets, Voyager 2 kept going, far beyond the orbits of the giants, far beyond the places where sunlight still feels familiar, out toward the boundary where the sun stops dominating the environment around it and interstellar space begins. That border is not a wall, it is not a gate. It is more like a fading influence, a place where the breath of our star grows weaker and the ocean between stars starts to press in. Voyager 2 crossed that border. It became one of the few human-made objects ever to enter interstellar space. That sounds glorious, and it is. But it is also lonely in a way that is hard to describe. Out there, everything is slow. Radio signals take many hours to travel one way. Commands are old by the time they arrive. Answers are history by the time they come back. The spacecraft survives on shrinking power from aging systems built in a different century. Every instrument that stays on has to justify its own existence. Every watt matters. Every decision becomes a trade between science and survival. So when something goes quiet out there, you do not just flip a switch and see what happened. You wait, you calculate, you hope. And sometimes hope is not enough. That is what makes the idea of Voyager 2 suddenly waking up so powerful. Because a spacecraft in that condition is not supposed to return from the dead like a movie monster. It is supposed to fade. First a small fault, then a missing response, then another system shut down to keep the core alive, then another. Then one day, the stream you have watched for years becomes thinner, stranger, weaker, and finally gone. Not dramatic, just finished. Which is why the first reaction to the new pulse was not excitement. It was suspicion. Engineers know that deep space is cruel to electronics. Cosmic rays can strike hardware and flip memory bits. Ancient code can behave in ugly ways when damaged. Weak signals can appear where none exist. Noise can pretend to be meaning. If you spend enough time around machines, you learn not to fall in love with the first explanation, especially when the first explanation feels impossible. So the signal was checked, then checked again, then routed through older logs and cleaner filters. And that is where the mood changed, because the pulse was not random. It arrived on the right frequency. It carried the spacing expected from Voyager 2's systems. Its timing was too clean for static, too disciplined for accidental noise, and too precise for a broken death rattle from a failing probe. Even stranger, the signal did not resemble panic. It resembled order. Think about that for a second. If a machine is breaking apart, you expect confusion, wrong values, garbage data, jumps and stutters, fragments. But this looked organized, not healthy, not normal. Organized. As if something inside the spacecraft had come online step by step in the correct sequence. Power regulation, memory access, transmission. like someone moving through a dark house and turning on only the rooms they needed. That was the first moment the event stopped feeling mechanical and started feeling intentional. Now imagine the pressure inside that control room. On one side, you have decades of engineering knowledge telling you not to invent ghosts in the system. On the other side, you have a dead probe acting with a kind of calm that makes no sense. And between those two realities sits a question nobody wants to say out loud. If Voyager 2 did not simply fail, then what touched it? The next few hours would turn that question into something much worse, because the pulse returned. Then it returned again, not at random intervals, but with a rhythm, enough rhythm to feel deliberate, enough repetition to suggest pattern. And once people look for a pattern, they almost always start finding the shape of something behind it. The engineers pulled old telemetry. They compared tiny details. They looked for signs of an automatic restart, a timer, a buried fault response, a command that had somehow looped back after years. None of it fit cleanly. The spacecraft should not have had the available power for a structured recovery. It should not have had the luxury of elegance, but elegance was exactly what the signal seemed to carry. And then another detail emerged. There appeared to be extra information nested inside the transmission. Not enough to look like a long message. Not enough to be obvious at first glance. Just a strange internal structure that did not match the patterns engineers expected from the spacecraft's old behavior. It was like hearing a familiar voice pronounce a word in a way that should belong to someone else. That is when fear truly begins, not when you know what you're looking at, but when you realize the familiar thing in front of you is no longer entirely familiar. You can tell yourself that is how horror works in movies. But the deeper truth is that this is how dread works in real life too. It does not begin with a monster stepping into the light. It begins with the smallest break in trust. A door you know you locked standing open. A phone ringing from a room where no phone should be. A machine following rules it was never taught. Voyager 2 had become that kind of machine. Then the investigation widened. If the signal was real, and if it was not a simple internal fault, maybe the answer was not inside Voyager at all. Maybe the spacecraft had not created the problem. Maybe it had encountered it. That idea changed everything. Because once you stop asking what is wrong with the probe and start asking what is around the probe, the darkness becomes crowded. Deep space is often described as empty, but empty is a human word for a place we barely understand. It is true that the regions beyond the planets are not packed with worlds and sunlight and dust the way inner space can be. But emptiness does not mean harmless. It does not mean inactive. It does not mean known. And known is the word that matters most. The farther Voyager 2 travels, the less often we get the comfort of comparing what it sees to the familiar. Out there, background fields matter. Charged particles matter. Subtle drifts matter. A tiny anomaly can be nothing. Or it can be the first clue that what we call nothing was only a limit in our own attention. So analysts started checking the environment around the signal. Radiation behavior, plasma measurements, frequency drift, tiny changes in the probe's motion, the kind of details nobody outside the field would ever notice, and the kind of details that become terrifying when they begin to line up. A pattern slowly formed. Voyager 2 did not just speak. It may have reacted. There were hints, small ones at first, that the spacecraft's behavior around the transmission did not look isolated. Certain changes seemed to happen in sequence, as if the pulse and the surrounding conditions belonged to the same event. A correction here, a delay there, a tiny adjustment that by itself meant almost nothing, but when laid beside the signal, timing started to look like footsteps beside a trail. That was when archived mission data became priceless. Because if you find something impossible once, the next question is brutal. Did it happen before, and did we miss it? If this story is pulling you in, leave a comment with one word: signal. It helps more people find the channel, and if you want more stories where science meets dread, hit subscribe now before the next clue drops. The search through old records was not glamorous. It was the opposite. Endless pages of telemetry. Strange spikes already dismissed decades ago. Temporary faults that once seemed too small to matter. The kind of buried material that only becomes important when the present teaches you how to read the past. And in that buried past, there were echoes. Not clear proof. Not at first. But echoes. A burst once labeled interference. A period of unexplained timing drift. A signal anomaly that had been filed, explained away, and forgotten because there was no reason at the time to build a larger story around it. That is one of the most unsettling parts of any discovery. The facts may already be sitting in a box. What changes is not the data. What changes is the meaning. When researchers laid those older anomalies next to the new Voyager 2 pulses, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Not identical, but close enough to disturb everyone in the room. What if Voyager 2 was not the first target? What if this was not a sudden encounter? What if the thing waking the spacecraft had been near human technology before, patient enough to remain unrecognized, careful enough to leave only fragments, and active enough to try again now? That is the moment a technical mystery turns into a human one, because human beings can live with not knowing. But what we cannot live with comfortably is the suspicion that something may have known us before we knew it. That possibility forced scientists to think beyond mechanics and beyond luck. If a repeated pattern existed across missions, then there were only a few broad possibilities. The first was ordinary but painful. Some rare space environment effect had fooled us twice. The second was harder. A hidden failure mode in our own machines had waited decades to reveal itself in ways we never predicted. And the third possibility was the one nobody wanted to own with their full voice. External influence, not necessarily aliens with flashing lights and perfect language. Real life is usually stranger and colder than that. External influence could mean a field, a structure, a process, or an intelligence so unlike our own. Our first contact with it would not feel like contact at all. It would feel like a machine behaving incorrectly. That is what makes this scenario so disturbing. If something vast and unfamiliar reached Voyager 2, it would not need to introduce itself in a way we understand. It would only need to interfere, to nudge, to alter, to make one old probe do one impossible thing, and let our own fear finish the rest. Around this point, every major question changes shape. Why now? Why Voyager 2? Why a pulse instead of silence? And if the signal is deliberate, who is it really for? The easiest answer is us. Earth, mission control, humanity. But that may not be the most frightening answer, because there is another possibility. The signal may not be a message sent to Earth. It may be a result, a residue, a side effect of an interaction happening far from us, with Voyager 2 acting less like a speaker and more like an instrument, like a bell that rang because something struck it. If that were true, then the pulse is not communication in the comfortable sense. It is evidence. Evidence that the spacecraft entered a condition we did not create. Evidence that something in deep space noticed it, tested it, or used it. Evidence that the oldest ambassador we ever sent into the dark may no longer be speaking entirely for us. That thought hit hardest when analysts examined how the pulse felt over time. Not emotionally felt, technically felt. Signal shape, repetition, stability, strength. Some readings suggested not just survival, but adaptation. Not huge adaptation, not science fiction miracles. Just subtle changes, the kind that make careful people uneasy. If the pattern was strengthening even slightly, then the old comfort of distance became a trap. Distance should weaken. Distance should blur. Distance should not become clearer unless something in the chain is compensating. And compensation implies process. Process implies control. Control implies a system. Now imagine being asked to explain that without sounding insane. This is where institutions become interesting. Because science is built on discipline, caution, and evidence. But scientists are also human beings sitting inside bodies that feel fear. They can remain careful in public while privately recognizing that a line has been crossed. Not a line in law, a line in intuition. The line between we observed a fault and we may be observing intent. What happens next in a story like this is not fireworks. It is listening. More stations are brought in. More instruments compare notes. More people dig through older files, wider files, stranger files. Patterns are searched for in places nobody had looked with this question before. If Voyager 2 truly woke, then the surrounding universe is no longer background. It is part of the case. That is when the fear moves closer to home. Because if a pulse can cross the dark between stars and arrive with structure, it does not remain a deep space problem forever. It becomes a radio problem, a monitoring problem, a systems problem, and eventually, if you are unlucky, a planetary problem. Picture observatories on different continents turning their ears to the same ghost. Picture the first moment two teams realize they are seeing the same rhythm. Picture the stomach drop that follows. Because one station can be wrong, two stations can be weird. But multiple stations, separated by oceans, begin to carve coincidence into shape. And then comes the hardest possibility of all. What if Earth is not merely receiving the signal? What if Earth is helping complete it? The scariest threats are rarely the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones that find the pattern your entire world already depends on. Quick pause. If your mind is racing right now, save this video for later and subscribe so you're here when we uncover the next impossible transmission. Now, take that thought one step further. Suppose the returning pulse from Voyager 2 is detected not only as a signal, but as a trigger. Not enough to shut cities down, not enough to make the danger obvious, just enough to create tiny disturbances in the systems humans trust. A flicker no one remembers tomorrow, a short dropout blamed on weather, a strange synchronization issue written off as routine noise. That is how a real warning could hide in plain sight, not by being invisible, but by being deniable. And denial is one of our favorite habits. We deny the meaning of odd events because meaning carries responsibility. If Voyager 2 simply glitched, we can study it. If Voyager 2 was touched, then we have to ask whether the thing that touched it has limits, motives, curiosity, or reach. Those are dangerous questions, because once asked, they cannot be unasked. At this stage, many people would want the story to become simple. find the signal, decode the message, discover the sender. But reality almost never gives us clean drama. It gives us fragments, pressure, unease, a pattern that feels intelligent without offering the mercy of explanation. That may be the most terrifying version of contact. Not the version where a voice speaks clear words across the stars. The version where our own tools begin to behave differently in its presence. Think about what that says about power. Humanity built Voyager 2 as a messenger. We launched it with mathematics, radio, and hope. We pointed it outward like a statement. We exist. We can learn. We can reach. We can endure. For decades, that statement held. The probe became a symbol of our intelligence and our patience. But if something beyond us can wake that messenger, the meaning of Voyager changes. It stops being a one-way declaration from humanity to the cosmos. It becomes a contested object, a shared surface, a place where our intention meets something that may not care about our categories at all. That is deeply unsettling because it threatens authorship. We want to believe our machines do what we built them to do. We want to believe our messages remain ours after they leave our hands. We want to believe distance protects us from immediate response. Voyager 2, in this story, tears at all three beliefs. 3. First, it suggests a machine can be repurposed in ways we never planned. Second, it suggests our farthest artifact can become readable to an outside force. Third, it suggests that crossing into the unknown does not guarantee anonymity. Maybe we were never as alone in the dark as we imagined. Maybe we were only first to speak in a language too small to protect us. And maybe that is why the pulse feels terrifying. Not because it proves invasion, but because it replaces comfort with asymmetry. If something understood our machine before we did, the balance is broken. In stories, people often ask the wrong first question. They ask, what is it? But the better question is, what does it know? A thing does not need a face to be dangerous. It needs awareness. It needs access. It needs a way to turn our own systems into mirrors. Voyager 2 may be small, but symbols are never small. The spacecraft carries our engineering choices, our timing, and even our optimism. If something can study that and respond through it, then it has already read more of us than we are comfortable admitting. That is why the most chilling version of this event is not a weapon. It is a demonstration, a tap on the glass, a reminder, a proof of reach. Imagine a civilization looking at Voyager 2 the way we might look at an antique lock. Not hard to break. More useful if opened carefully and studied. That would explain the elegance. That would explain the restraint. That would explain why the first transmission feels like a handprint. And if that interpretation is even partly true, then the real terror is still ahead, because first contact is not always a conversation. Sometimes first contact is the moment you realize the other side has already tested the door. So where does that leave us? With a silent machine that may not be silent anymore. With a signal that may be more than a signal. With old records that suddenly look less dead. And with one brutal possibility hanging over all of it. Voyager 2 did not wake up alone. If this were only a story about hardware, it would be sad. But it turns one of humanity's proudest creations into a stage for uncertainty. The farther from Earth it happens, the more exposed we feel. Because if even our most distant machine can be found, read, and answered, then distance is not the shield we hoped it was. That is why the first transmission is terrifying. Not because we fully understand it, because we do not. Because a mystery sitting at the edge of the solar system is one thing. A mystery that seems to understand rhythm and response is another. And a mystery that can borrow our own technology to announce itself is something else entirely. It is a warning that the universe may not greet us with language first. It may greet us with interference, with imitation, with a question hidden inside a machine we thought belonged only to us. So tonight, when you look up at the sky, remember this. The space between stars feels empty because our senses are small. But emptiness is not proof of absence. Silence is not proof of safety. And the oldest human voices traveling through the dark may one day return carrying more than our own reflection. If that day ever comes, the question will not be whether we were brave enough to send a probe. The question will be whether we are ready for an answer.